Shoot. All right. And we are live with the first ever episode of this new State of the Nation series. Whew. Being on Malaya Wose's channel has me like tongue-tied. Whatever. It was a fun stream, but now, instead of talking about postmodernism and all of its complicated nonsense, let's talk about something that's not very complicated: the state of South Africa. Now, I kind of put on the stream, I guess, or I tried to organize the stream last minute. It was something that was scrambled to find people on. I'm very thankful for Mr. Patriarch here for coming on such short notice. And since it is like, what time is it in South Africa right now?
Yeah, right now it's 1:06 a.m.
Geez, that's really rough. And we may be joined later by a mystery guest. I bet you can never really figure out who that is. Just don't look in the video description. Mr. Patriarch, who are you? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm all about the shilling. So yeah, my name is Mr. Patriarch. I have a YouTube channel, which I started a number of months ago. I mostly deal with history and sort of political philosophy. I studied history in university sort of by training, and I'm also a teacher. So that's kind of that's sort of the lens that I sometimes try to sort of understand and sort of analyze sort of current trends. So my latest project, I just finished a multi-part series on fascism of the Italian variety and compared it to Nazism and stuff. So that's kind of what I do as far as the YouTube game goes. And I am, as you can probably guess from my accent, I am not from South Africa. What happened was I met a cute girl online, and then we ended up getting married, started a family, and decided to stay here in South Africa. So I've been here since 2017. I'm originally from Alaska, and that's me.
Yeah, so that's a rather interesting perspective. But do you feel like you have a good grasp on, I guess, the general vibe of politics and history, like what's actually like to live in the country?
Yeah, no, I definitely would. The good thing about South Africa and countries kind of like it is sort of the political situation becomes pretty obvious pretty quick. So yeah, and I've since my time here, like I've always been, sort of interested in history. So when I was a kid, I learned about the Anglo-Boer Wars and stuff, and I was always kind of peripherally interested in South Africa. And then when I sort of, started putting my roots here, then I sort of took more of a deep dive, as it were. And I got a lot of friends in South Africa, and I learned a lot from them. And so I do know something about the country. I don't claim to be an expert, but I guess I know more than your average American would. And it's a fascinating place. It's got its good and its bad. And kind of being the to quote the Sir Moldbug, I'm living the clear pill down here, right? So
yeah,
I am the expat living in the third world, semi-third world country, sort of analyzing it, sort of semi-detached.
Yeah, just as a little background of how much I know about South Africa, I know the history of South Africa from two books, The Great Democracies by Winston Churchill. He goes through the history of all of the Anglo colonies, and I got about halfway through Diamond's Golden War. It was a flashy book on early South African history that I picked up from a Barnes and Noble a little while ago. It just depicted the insanity of the gold rush. There are also, of course, a bunch of other history channels out there that have covered, I guess, the history of South Africa. Although I've noticed that it tends to break down into two different categories, like history of South Africa YouTube. It's either the Boer Wars or the history of apartheid. Like it's one or the
Yeah.
other. There's like in preparation for the stream, I did a good bit of digging for I guess post-apartheid documentaries, just trying to see what the fallout was, and there's surprisingly little in terms of coverage. You'll see like a 3-minute video here or there, but other than that, um, it's kind of a blackout, which is why I needed people onto the stream. So for the actual stream itself and for this series going forward, I want to break it into I guess 4 different parts. Start by introducing guests, of course, and then going on to the first topic, last century of history, right? So what exactly is what were the major, I guess, events that occurred in South Africa post World War II, or maybe even during World War II? Like I've noticed a lot of these, a lot of the post-colonial struggles really have their start in, I guess, resentment for the empire after World War I and II, or I guess the waning of empire post World War II. What exactly was that like for South Africa?
That's a good question. So South Africa, so compared to a lot of, sorry, my throat is a little worn out from the time. South Africa is a little different than most formerly colonized African countries in a number of key ways. The first most important thing that sets it apart is it had a comparatively very large settler population. Okay, so that in turn, so you end up getting a big enough deposit of colonials initially, who over time began to develop in a way sort of apart from the old country, right? So I tend to think of the Afrikaners as kind of analogous to Americans in a certain way, in that, yes, they're predominantly Dutch and French Huguenot in descent, but they've been severed. They'd severed ties enough from the old country so that they sort of develop an identity of their own, right? In the same way that Americans did, right? So America, of course, had the 13 colonies, and there was a kinship to Britain, but they sort of partially because of the frontier experience, possibly, and also just the isolation of living in America and the isolation of living in South Africa. They sort of kind of developed their own, you almost have ethnogenesis forming, essentially. So that is one of the key main differences of South Africa and what sets it apart from the rest of Africa. Because, of course, for the rest of Africa, the climate and malaria and things like that alone was enough to deter any sizable colonialization. So South Africa is kind of unique in that regard. The big events that happened in South Africa, a lot of people like to start with apartheid, but the Boer Wars was kind of it's sort of what I think was largely responsible for, at least partially responsible for, creating ethnic consciousness for the Afrikaners because of what they had to deal with at the hands of the British, right? So for those who don't know, essentially what happened was the all the Afrikaners basically lived in the Western Cape initially, which is the province where Cape Town is. And then sort of what happened is that eventually came under British colonial control. And you had a lot of Afrikaners who weren't particularly happy, and also some coloreds. And coloreds is not a racial slang in South Africa. Colored just means a mulatto, who is typically a mix of Dutch ancestry and Khoisan, who are the indigenous people in the Western Cape. And particularly around Cape Town, you might also have some Malay admixture in there, which is why they like curry so much, I imagine. So,
like,
and
we
what you
could
had
get into it, like just to I guess give a little bit more clarity about who the Boers were and why there was conflict between them and the British. Like just as the very very brief timeline shows, the Dutch originally settled South Africa during the late 1600s, 1700s. And when the British eventually took over the colony, the Boers fled to the interior. Many of the Boers, of course, were imported laborers who came to South Africa to farm while the merchants kind of used South Africa as a port, was it like a refreshing station?
Yeah,
for ships circumnavigating the globe.
A lot of the maritime traffic at the time would go around the Cape of Good Hope, so it was a really important port territory.
Yeah, so you have British mostly on the coast, Boers moving into the interior. The interior being mostly home to was it the Khoisan? Isn't that how you say it?
The Khoisan were predominant.
They were the original inhabitants of South Africa until the Bantu expansion.
Yes, that's true. Most of the Khoisan were actually originally kind of here in the Western Cape, but there's also a lot of them actually live in the Kalahari Desert, and they part of the reason why they live there is they were pushed there by the Xhosas and the Zulus and sort of other Bantu tribes. So and not all the Boers left, but a lot of them did. Probably most of them did. And so, like you say, they left the British Cape Colony and they moved into the interior, and they founded the Boer republics. The biggest ones will probably be the Transvaal Republic of South Africa, and they had these little countries essentially, and that's sort of what's called the Great Trek is what it's called. Is when they moved, that's sort of when they came into heavy contact with the Bantus, so the Xhosas and the Zulus.
Yes, so that's what the 1840s, 1850s, something like that.
Yeah.
And then I guess that created a very a very hardened, exclusive Boer identity, sandwiched between native Bantus that despised them for encroaching on their territory, and then the British who want to, I guess, wipe away their sort of national identity and replace it with English. And then there was the discovery of gold, right? Yeah. And diamonds. I'm sorry, diamonds. Which was the first big rush to South Africa? Like that was
I think part of when the Boers initially left, the British, they didn't particularly care. But what ended up happening is in these Boer republics, especially in what is now Gauteng, which is the province where Johannesburg is, they found a lot of gold there. And then sort of once they did find, once they sort of struck pay dirt in these Boer colonies, then it became of interest to the crown to sort of annex these territories for the purposes of basically getting at the gold.
Gotcha. And with that, with this discovery of gold, came the Boer Wars, and I guess the Boers clamoring for national autonomy, to kind of hold on to those profits instead of just living at a subsistence level of just living off the land through agriculture or something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, the Boers, they were always big on farming, and they still are. And that's what, for anyone listening who doesn't know, that's what the word Boer means in Afrikaans and Dutch is farmer. So yeah, you had basically they just sort of wanted to get their own piece of land where they could sort of do their own things. And initially, these Boer republics, they weren't really big. So it would be sort of an area where they could kind of, people and sort of have control and autonomy in their own specific zone. But they weren't like sprawling empires or anything. And so the main thing that they were into, of course, is, farming. But there was some mining and stuff. And later on, they would be, a lot of them would be working in the gold mines. And it was pretty bad conditions. So just as an anecdote, a lot of the miners who would work in these gold mines in Gauteng, what they would actually do is remove their teeth because they couldn't afford dental care. So they just be like, look, my teeth are going bad. And they just literally pull their teeth out so they wouldn't have to pay for dentistry. And they just survive on mealie pop, which is basically cornbread or cornmeal gruel and stuff. So it was pretty rough.
Brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely brutal during these rushes. But how did these end up leading to the Boer Wars?
Well, it's funny. History, oftentimes, you see sort of cycles repeat. So believe it or not, part of the reason was the way that they sold the Boer Wars in Britain was for freedom and democracy, oddly enough.
The international community has its eyes on the Boers.
Yes, exactly. So they want the gold, but they can't just, in order to sort of save face and not look like the bad guys, they had to drum up a reason. And one of the reasons that they came up with was British people living in the Boer republics were very often sort of excluded from the vote. And it wasn't necessarily because they were British, but there were some pretty stringent restrictions. It was a qualified franchise, right? Like you saw in America in the early years. And they're like, oh, our British brethren are being oppressed in these Boer republics. They're excluded. This is terrible. We gotta liberate these. We got to liberate these places. We got to bring them democracy. Is essentially it. In a small microcosm, right? So it wasn't like what you saw with the war in Iraq or anything like that. But they had pretext to that was partially kind of the pretext that they used to invade the Boer republics, and they invaded twice. First in the late 1800s, and then again, I believe in 1902. I can't remember the exact date, but the first Boer War, the Boers were actually victorious, and they managed to repel the British. But then the second one, the British sort of did a much more of a scorched earth policy. So
the notorious concentration camps.
So basically, in order to deal with the sort of guerrilla insurgency. This is interesting from a military historical perspective, because typically it's pretty hard to prosecute a guerrilla war when you're not the guerrilla side, right? Because they just dissipate into the countryside. But the British had a solution to that, and their solution was to burn the farms, confiscate, the sustenance, and put all the women and children into concentration camps. So, and it worked. So it's very heavy-handed, very brutal, but that's kind of what they did, and it,
Like
that's how they won.
like as kind of an aside, of a very strange peculiarity of the British, I guess, colonist settler colonies is that instead of creating, I guess, mixed race middlemen to instead of having sort of an aristocracy of say Spanish or Portuguese aristocrats running the colony, and they're sort of mixed race or peasant underlings managing the colony, and then the sort of natives as underlings. The British were much more into, I guess, sort of a separation, or I wouldn't say segregation, but the Boers and the British had their own colonies. They did not mix with they had their own territories. They did not mix with the natives, and this creates sort of an all or nothing conflict that we'll see later on. I mean, so these tight knit Boer communities, they go through an arduous process of creating their own little independent republics. They create their own independent little republics. They get somewhat wealthy through these big booms of national resources. Meanwhile, the Brits step in and steal their plunder, and then World War I happens.
Yeah.
Now, what was the effect of World War I on South Africa?
Well, I guess. Sorry, man. My voice is giving out at 1:30. But the effect in South Africa was, well, not exactly a whole lot different than what you would see in other colonial parts of the British Empire, except for the fact that German Southwest Africa was directly next to it. So what is now Namibia used to be a German colony. And there was actually a pretty extensive military campaign, which I can't remember the German's name, but brilliant military commander. And he was able to basically keep his division going throughout the entire war and was basically never defeated. And actually made heavy use of indigenous black troops. But they were drilled and they executed their orders and had the competency of command in such a way that they were an excellent fighting force. And the British were never able to overcome them until the end of the war, when, of course, armistice and then the Treaty of Versailles and all that, at which point the British gained control of Namibia, what is now Namibia. So you had a bit of a division between the people in South Africa about the war. So the British colonials, of course, were on the side of the crown, but the Afrikaners were actually pro Central Powers because they hated the British.
Is this sort of like how the Irish were neutral during the World Wars? Kind of despite the British.
Yeah, no, and you got to keep in mind. I mean, the Anglo-Boer Wars, they ended like not even 20 years before World War I, right? So this is like it'd be like the war in Iraq now, the span of time. So the Boers are still really salty. They have a living memory of sort of what they had to deal with regarding British colonial power. So they weren't, they weren't exactly gung ho for the crown during the First World World War. And the reason I spend all this time sort of elaborating on sort of the importance of the Boer War is because it really does shape the ethnic consciousness of the Boers. So, like I said, they're a mix of people, right? They're predominantly Dutch, but there's also a strong French Huguenot connection. So you'll see names like Leroux or Treblanc down here a lot. And what you ended up having is kind of an ethnogenesis. So they interbreed with the Dutch, and Afrikaans sort of becomes its own sort of language, very closely related to Dutch, but still sort of distinct. And then because of the and they're also all Calvinists. That's the other thing. So they're all Reformed Calvinist theology, big on Old Testament. And then also because of the experience of founding their own republics, having them taken away by the British, and having them and their families suffer greatly during the course of the Second Anglo-Boer War, it really does a lot to sort of shape Afrikaner consciousness. And that is going to play a very key role in sort of what would come later during apartheid.
Okay, so World War I happens. There was a great amount of resentment towards the British getting the Boers roped into this World War. The Great Depression, does that have much of an impact on South Africa? Or is it more of
like, you mean the experience of the First World War, like a similar experience that you would see in like continental Europe in terms of like,
I'm saying, like after World War One, do things go somewhat back to normal, or does the Great Depression and the post-war, like the sort of post-war turbulence, have any effect on the nation?
Well, what ends up happening is after, actually shortly before the First World War, you have the Union of South Africa created, which was
okay. So that's the complete absorption of these Boer republics into the colony of South Africa.
And forge it into something which is a bit less of a colony. So the Union of South Africa was kind of like how Canada used to be. It is still, it was essentially a self-governing dominion of the British Empire, which had sort of full sovereignty confirmed later, I think in 1926. So it was already, before this, kind of had become sort of its own thing to a certain degree. And that just sort of intensified after the First World War. So like I said, the formal sovereignty of the Union of South Africa came during the Balfour Declaration of 1926. And that's during the interwar years. So that may have played a part in it, the experience of the First World War in that.
Yeah. Speak of the devil, Jonathan's actually in the chat right now.
Jonathan Pohl?
Yeah. Didn't you say he was a South African?
No. He's just Jonathan Pohl. He's a historian who runs a channel. Although he did live in Ghana for a number of years, he was a professor there.
Gotcha. Yeah. So World War II and its impact. So what happens, I guess, after the creation of the BUF and during this World War time frame? Is there sort of like a nationalist impulse among the settlers, or is it more of what exactly happens during this time frame?
Well, there was actually a little bit less action, I think, than in the First World War, because again, at that point, most of the military campaigns in Africa that happened during the Second World War was, of course, in Northern Africa. So you have a lot of people who do serve, for the British. Oh, hello, Clossington. Are you there? Hold on. Someone say something in the chat if you can hear me. I'm not sure if again at that point Clossington dipped out or whatnot.
Oh,
can you guys hear?
My bad.
Right.
I hit a bad button.
No, that's all right. But anyway, so what ended up happening? So the First World War saw actually more action in and around South Africa because of the German presence in what is now Namibia. So in the Second World War, you did see a lot of action happen in the Northern Africa, where a lot of people who were part of the Union of South Africa were sort of shipped up north to fight the war effort up there. What you did see again, is sort of Afrikaner resentment at the British. And so what ended up happening is in 1934, the South African Party and the National Party. So the National Party, of course, would later be the party which ruled during the apartheid years. They merged in 1934 to form the United Party, and in an attempt to sort of reconcile between the two white tribes, right? So to get the English and the Afrikaners sort of to put the past behind them and try and move forward. However, in 1939. The South African Party split over the entry of the Union into World War II. So the National Party did not want to join the war, and they did not want to join the war as an ally of the United Kingdom. So the National Party strongly opposed actually entry into World War I, and the Second World War actually caused split between the Anglo and the sort of Afrikaners. So the South African Party was wrecked, and then you sort of had the United Party was wrecked, and then so the National Party and the South African Party split because of the Second World War.
Right, and this National Party, it has become somewhat infamous for its role in implementing apartheid later down the line. So it's mostly formed of Boer leadership, correct?
Yeah, pretty much exclusively Boer leadership. Yeah,
and isn't it also heavily populated by like union? Well, I guess like labor unions and I guess protectionists.
Yeah, no, they do play a part, and a lot of the early trade union action in South Africa originated because of the mining industry and kind of the conditions that were faced there. And also a lot of the even communism, like the first South African Communist Party got its start there as well. And at the time, I think their slogan was "Communism for a White South Africa." And the idea was
edgy boys.
Yeah. And the idea was that they'd sort of have socialism for sort of themselves, but they didn't want to compete with black labor was the main thing. So during so
this is white nationalist socialism.
Yeah. So that's
yes.
that was the early roots of communism in South Africa, and also with trade unionism. It was about protection of Afrikaner jobs at the expense of Bantu entry into the mining workforce as competition to drive down wages and whatever.
Yeah. So like I've also done a good bit of research into, I guess, Rhodesia and countries like or Rhodesia never had this sort of trade union influence compared to South Africa, which I think is strange. But you just chalk it up to mining and heavy industry encourages unionism.
Yeah, I think that's an important point you bring up. So in South Africa, like I said, you had a much bigger population, and you had also industrialization. Whereas in Rhodesia, pretty much all the industry
farmland.
It was agricultural. It was the breadbasket of Africa. So you didn't have the same kind of, lurching social problems that you get with industrialization happening in Rhodesia. And also, again, the population was much smaller, and it was pretty much mostly concerned with farming.
Right. I mean, it's strange that the Communist Party are also ethnats. Like, it's just how the ANC developed as communists and communist sympathizers, and how I guess the priest class that always sort of agitates towards socialism and against the sort of settler interests always. It's a very strange, I guess, juxtaposition compared to the rest of sort of post-colonial conflicts. It's strange. So how does apartheid actually develop in South Africa? So this is like 1948 or something like that.
Yeah. So apartheid. Sorry, I gotta clear my throat here again. So yeah, apartheid really got started in 1948, and again, what happened was you had South Africa got more and more sort of independence from the crown. Like I said, they sort of became recognized as a sort of sovereign entity. And then eventually in 1961, they would eventually basically sever all ties from Britain. So what happened was you had, of course, the franchise was restricted to white South Africans only. So whether they're British or Afrikaners. And then so what you ended up having was apparently there was quite a bit of gerrymandering on part of the National Party to make sure that the election turned out the way they wanted to.
Right.
And they ended up taking control of the country in 1948. And the sort of unionist element, which was sort of headed up by Jan Smuts, was sort of defeated thoroughly at that point. And then you sort of had the introduction of apartheid. And again, I think a lot of the impetus for apartheid sort of came again from this sort of seething resentment of the British. Because again, like the Anglo-Boer War had finished up not even 50 years prior to when apartheid was instituted and the Afrikaners were on top. So they thought, all right, cool. Now we're in charge. So we'll sort of do things our way. And you sort of had this notion of grand apartheid, where you would eventually sort of break up the country into different pieces. So you had the Bantustans, as they're called, and they're sort of like these internationally unrecognized countries within South Africa.
I always envisioned them as something like protectorates within a British colony. The same way. I don't know. The Middle East was divvied up in Sykes-Picot, something like that.
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. But so the Boers are sort of in charge of South Africa in 1948, totally, and then they begin implementing apartheid. So I think, and just to sort of be fair here, part of the thing is now that they were in control, this idea of kind of having, you know, if they wanted to, they could have said, all right, you know, we're going to move back to the Western Cape. We're going to break it off from the rest of South Africa. The Western Cape is going to be the new Boer Republic, or the Free State and the Western Cape will be two Boer republics. And, you know, then the rest of the country can sort of do its own thing, and we'll just sort of have our own kind of enclaves where we live. But they wanted it all, essentially. So one of the big things that was of interest to the National Party was sort of having access to cheap black labor, essentially. So you had the process of urbanization happening before apartheid, of course, but during the years of apartheid, that's when you saw a really big acceleration. And it was advantageous to the Afrikaners to sort of exploit this, utilize this very large and very affordable labor force for their own ends in sort of construction or whatever it is. So it was sort of the poison chalice. So they kind of they wanted the what would you call it? They wanted the they wanted to be in charge and sort of run the country like it was a Boer republic, but while allowing, you know, all this labor to sort of move in outside of the cities and these townships, and, you know, try and deal with the social repercussions that would come later. So that was kind of the problem with apartheid from the get-go. A moral aspect aside, from purely a consequentialist base, it was a pretty shaky system after a certain point, once you get a critical mass of people who move into these cities from the Bantustans.
Well, if you have something like if you're motivated purely by anti-British hatred, or I guess resentment of the British for all that they've done over the last century, and you finally have control over the country, you have control over the country. You're not going back to the small pickings, right? You're gonna go in for the gold, and
yeah,
I'm not sure what they could have done if I mean there's always the temptation of just creating an incredibly cheap labor force for yourself, and having a sort of protectionist racket.
That was, I think, essentially sort of what did it. And so it would be like the Republic of Texas back in the day, like taking over Mexico, and then like encouraging Mexicans to move outside of Dallas and Houston, but treat them as second-class citizens and not expect them to get mad.
You know? That is absolutely absurd. I mean, I wouldn't put it past Texans, but there's only so much they could actually do.
Yeah, but that was kind of the structural problem of apartheid. Is it did eventually cause a lot of social tensions once you had these large enough Bantu populations pop up outside of your cities. Places like Soweto, Kailicha is another one outside of Cape Town, and so.
Yeah, I brought up a nice little map of the Bantustans that I just found off the internet. I'm not sure what year this is, but like all this cyan is the Zulu territory. I'm not sure how to pronounce most of these.
Natal, Transvaal, Swaziland.
I'm not sure how long you could keep. What would it be, like 80% of the population on a reservation, or yeah. I'm not sure how long that could actually last, but it did last up until, was it 1994? Was it?
Yeah, 94 is when they had the elections, but most of the pretty restrictive apartheid acts were abolished by, I believe, 1991. So like the real unpleasant aspects of apartheid, aside from basically the one man, one vote thing, were basically gone by 1991. Also, I forgot to mention this earlier, but in 1913, you also had the Native Lands Act, which was imposed by the British, which severely restricted ownership of land by blacks. And what that ended up doing, and ended up becoming kind of a problem later, is from a free market aspect, if you want to look at this like like an Austrian or whatever, it sort of put heavy restrictions on sort of like willing buyer, willing seller stuff as regards land, right? So that kind of hampered economic growth if you're concerned about that kind of thing. But apart from that, what it ended up doing is it put a lot of the Bantus, the Xhosas, the Zulus, the Sutus, in areas that over time became difficult to sustain the populations.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's always the sort of ecological case for not being a subsistence farmer, because it just drains the land very, very quickly.
Yeah. And
like specialization in commercial farming.
Right. And also, again, so of course, during this time, the Bantu population increases dramatically. And so although the Bantu stands and sort of the land allotted to them under the Native Lands Act may have been sufficient for them on a time, they weren't sufficient any longer. It became a lot harder to sort of, thrive in some of these areas because of the land restrictions placed upon the Bantus.
Right. So that brings us to more, I guess, recent history, where you had the weight of just the absolute weight of this population boom, plus unsustainable protectionism, plus, I guess, the moral outrage of the world. But who exactly are the people that oppose or fought against this regime? Like specifically the anti-apartheid movement, specifically the ANC.
Yeah. So it's important to note at the time that there was actually diverse sort of opposition to apartheid. So you had the what was called the Progressive Party, and they were more like, think about them as like classical liberals. Basically, they just wanted, sort of liberal, sort of more liberal, live in a more liberal legal structure in South Africa. So you had opposition from, and those were mostly Anglos. So you had English opposition to apartheid, basically from the get-go, for the most part. You also had different Black opposition to apartheid, and you also had some colored opposition to apartheid. So the coloreds, if you look at the map that Clossington has, they're mostly all in the Western Cape around Cape Town. And in fact, they make up in the province of in the province of the Western Cape today, they are the largest racial group. So they're the mulattoes I was talking about earlier. And under the system of apartheid, they were treated less as foreigners than the Blacks were, but they still had restrictions. So like intermarriage was, kind of a no-no. Like my father-in-law was, he's colored, but his dad was Portuguese, and he was telling me about how he was like a manager at some place, his dad, and like, oh yeah, we got this company house you can live in. He's like, yeah, but just like my wife's colored, like would that be a problem? And they're like, yeah, sorry, like we can't let you in, but don't worry, we're not going to narc on you to the cops or anything. So yeah.
So you cut off even no free house somewhat sympathetic people.
Yeah. So I got a soft spot for the colors. I think about them as kind of the Mexicans of Africa, because they kind of are in a certain way.
there's a subset of Hispanics called Castizos.
Mm.
They're like there are shades of different Hispanic people out there, depending on how much native admixture there is. Like going from like mestizo, which is full native, to castizo, which is almost completely white. Like I could just imagine these people who on the face of it just look white, just getting refused I guess basic services.
Yeah, no, it did cause a lot of
unless you're the most hardcore hardcore proponent of racial segregation, it's kind of hard not to support, I guess, the coloreds and their sort of predicament.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, they're kind of a product of the South African experience in a way. Like, I mean, and it used to, we're getting on a tangent about the coloreds, but they were for a long time they were kind of on decent terms with the Dutch and then the Afrikaners. So actually I think the first governor of the Cape Colony was actually a colored guy, and his name was Simon van der Stel. And he was, his dad was, some Dutch explorer who came to the colony, and then he married a Khoisan woman. And then, because of the, he was brought up well and whatnot and was quite capable. So like, hey, you speak Khoisan, you were born and raised here, you're competent. Yeah. How about you be governor? And so,
right.
So that was kind of the experience there. But, yeah, so it did cause, the social tensions, like white beaches only, sort of things like that. That did cause a lot of social tensions. But despite that, the coloreds, both then and now, even though they didn't like apartheid, they did they did get on well with whites, more so than blacks. And a lot of it has to do with the cultural similarities, right? So they do share at least partial shared ancestry. They're culturally much, much more Western than the Bantus are. And they also speak Afrikaans, and they're all, main religion is Christianity without any tribal stuff. So, there is a kinship there. And someone's typing in the chat, it says coloreds like Indians. That is actually a different racial group. The Indians are basically all in Durban. So Durban is a city in KwaZulu-Natal.
Yeah, so that's right here in the east.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a ton of Indians over there in Durban specifically. But
were they sort of imported as I guess middle managers or cheap laborers or something like that?
Yeah. So what originally happened with the Indians is they were brought over by the British to work as laborers, I believe, in cotton originally. So KwaZulu-Natal, unlike the Western Cape, is quite they get quite a lot of rain over there, and it's much more of a tropical climate. So you can grow things there that you can't necessarily grow in the Western Cape as easily. So the Indians were brought over there to sort of work that. But eventually, as Indians tend to do over time, they sort of elevated themselves and became pretty affluent, and they still are.
Gotcha. So I guess, I was expecting to go through each of these four categories in about 15 to 20 minutes, but there's so much context that you need for South Africa, I guess, to actually understand apartheid.
Yeah, that's true. But just real quick, just sort of before we talk about the current political factions, I'll just quickly lightning round talk about sort of the struggle, as it were. So in South Africa, you did have the ANC, who were, one of the major anti-apartheid activist organizations, right? So, but they were not alone. And what is misunderstood is they weren't even the biggest anti-apartheid group among the blacks. So the biggest one who actually had much more support was actually the Zulus, the Inkatha Freedom Party under Buthelezi. And he's still alive. Buthelezi, interesting factoid, was actually in the movie Zulu as one of the Zulu kings, and he's still around. He's like 90-something years old. But what ended up happening, so Buthelezi basically wanted a much more federated, sort of conservative kind of political structure with much more regional autonomy and stuff. But the ANC sort of fell into the Soviet orbit, of course. And then what you had prior to 1994 is you had something called the People's War. And what that was a pretty hot, intense black-on-black violence of the ANC targeting various other anti-apartheid black movements. So the goal was that they would, to put it bluntly, they'd crush these potential competitors so that when the negotiations eventually came around, they'd be the only ones with a seat at the table.
So are there competitors? Okay, so you had the Zulus who were organizing as a sort of federalist party, as in pro-federalism, and then you had the ANC, which was more centralist, right?
Right.
Or like pro-centralization.
Much more centralist and much more leftist.
And much more leftist. So did they ever receive any direct funding from the Soviet Union or from Maoist China, or like the same way like ZANU was in Rhodesia?
Yeah. No, I'm sure they received funding of some kind. Like I can't. They did have quite a lot of support from communist countries at the time, and they were sort of harbored. The militant wing of the ANC was harbored, I believe, in Angola, and the people in charge of the ANC, I believe, got training. I could be wrong with the country, but like East Germany or someplace, the ANC did receive aid and funding from the Soviet bloc at various points in their career, and they got ideological training, organizational training, and so on and so forth. And they probably helped bankroll the organization as well.
Like in preparation for this stream, I watched a smaller documentary, and it depicted the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was some spy that was trying to subvert the communist activities of the ANC. I forget who it was, but he kind of had to do all sorts of apologetics for how rough the government was on these dissidents. But was the ANC, I guess, I see the word terrorist being thrown around a lot, but how terroristic were they to I guess the apartheid regime and to the other anti-apartheid groups?
Well, they did engage in terroristic activity against the apartheid regime. So, they'd attack police stations. There was a couple of high-profile bombings that happened. But the majority, and this is always left out, the majority of violence during the struggle, as they called it, occurred against other Black anti-apartheid groups. I believe something as many as 20,000 people were killed by the ANC, and specifically Black people were killed by the ANC during these struggle years. So anyone who was thought to be collaborating with, the regime, they'd be necklaced, which is basically they'd have a tire put around their neck and then filled up with kerosene, and they'd be lit on fire alive. That was a fairly...
I saw that Mandela's wife was notorious for this practice.
Yeah, Mandela's wife was a fan of necklacing, Winnie Mandela. And yeah, like I said, they were very violent towards Inkatha, which was a predominantly Zulu nationalist party.
Wait, so
And yeah, there was a lot of violence directed from the ANC toward other Black South Africans, and it wasn't because they were necessarily pro-apartheid. It's because their vision of what South Africa should be after apartheid did not match theirs.
like what was there any sort of like ethnic underpinning to ANC? Like were they
Yeah.
represented by some other tribe?
So the ANC was predominantly a Xhosa with a click, a
Yeah.
Xhosa political party. So Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, uh, and I believe that one interim president that everyone forgets about who was there for like 6 months. They're all Xhosas. But what ended up, I guess we'll save that for later. But yeah, they eventually managed to absorb the Zulus, but for a long, long time, the ANC was a predominantly Xhosa political party, and the Inkatha party was a Zulu party.
Okay, gotcha. So when apartheid does fall, who are the major players that move in to take the place of the National Party? Like, is there sort of a monumental, I guess, political shift in who actually is in the reins of power? Like, of course, there was Mandela, who was let out of prison, but exactly what happens in 1994?
Yeah, so on the face of it, the initial transition wasn't that extreme. So what ended up happening is Nelson Mandela, prior to the end of apartheid, very shortly before, went to Davos, and
Oh
he
no.
basically he basically said, "Look, like, don't worry, we're not going to go whole communist. Like, we'll make concessions. We can be reasonable, and like, yeah, you don't need to worry about us. We're not going to turn this place into Zimbabwe." So, and that was sort of good PR for him, and it did signify a change. So after apartheid ended, they had something called the GEAR policy, which is an acronym for something that I can't remember, but basically it was a moderation of the economic policies that they had previously held. So they had dropped the communism, and it was much more pragmatic, sort of market, sort of economy policy, and that was also when you saw a lot of growth happen in South Africa. So part of the growth was because the restrictions, all the international restrictions were lifted. So of course you see a big rebound from that. But also the government for a time did function somewhat competently. And part of it was because you didn't have the massive CADA deployment and staffing of all the positions with cronies and whatnot. So that
Right.
the ANC was smart enough at the time to realize that they couldn't just do that right away. So they didn't like fire all the white people at once and staff them with their cousins. So there was an initially fairly moderate, with some social democracy, of course, which sort of came about at this time. And that's when you saw also, in terms of government policy, that's when social grants became a big thing. So in South Africa, you see a very similar thing happen. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, my PowerPoint just flashed.
Oh,
It's all good. I wasn't there something of a crime wave that happened after apartheid ended? Like that's sort of something I've picked up on a lot of the post-apartheid documentaries. Like they're
yeah.
being, yeah.
No. So there's sort of two periods of it. So the first is there was a lot of violence happening in the 80s during, sort of this armed struggle and inter-ethnic conflict that was going on before the end of apartheid when things really ramped up. But then, you also did see a big increase in crime since the end of apartheid. But I think it was a sort of fairly gradual thing. It didn't happen right away, but it did definitely happen. And it really began to get bad, I would say probably in the 2000s. So because at that point, a lot of the institutional structures which had existed and functioned began to be eroded through basically crony placement and also changes in policing laws. The death penalty was abolished, and just as sort of one example, sort of highlighting this, in 1994 there were about 100,000 policemen and 100,000 security guards in South Africa. Now there's about 150,000 policemen and about over 500,000 private security in South Africa. So that kind of gives you an indication of sort of where the country's at as regards, protection against crime and sort of the current crime situation.
Yeah. I mean, I knew South Africa had an absolutely massive private security complex, but I didn't know it was just that massive, like 500,000. Yeah. Like this, like like that's a complete collapse of law and order into the private realm. Like
no, it really isn't, and it's pretty astounding. So like in South, like where specifically where I live in sort of my neighborhood, there is a police station nearby, but and it's actually, as far as I can tell, not a particularly bad one because I live in a pretty decent area. But most of the actual sort of policing is done by a local security company. So they are the ones who are sort of out on patrol. They actually have an ambulance. They have sort of armed security response and whatnot. And they do a really good job of keeping the neighborhood I live in safe. But it just goes to show that state policing has basically cratered in terms of quality and competency. And the places that are, of course, most affected by this are spots of the country where people don't have the resources to afford these kinds of, amenities, things that should be carried out by the state, but simply aren't. So in places like Guguletu and Kailicha, some of the black townships in and around Cape Town, where I live, they're basically lawless areas, and things just happen in there, and it's really bad. And in the Cape Flats, which is where a lot of the coloreds live, you sort of see an emergent gang culture, which has sort of come up again after apartheid. There was always sort of a smaller criminal element there, but gangsterism in the Western Cape is a huge problem, and the murder rates are like what you'd find in cartel land. So, and these are again areas which don't have private security.
Yeah. So you have a complete collapse of, I guess, any sort of rural law and order, and as well as, I guess, more black and impoverished areas, and then the complete militarization of any sort of real wealth. Like, aren't like government employees fairly well armed compared to other people?
So you can get guns in South Africa. I know people who have them, but it is quite a bit more hard than in the US, obviously. And
right.
The politicians are, of course, well armed and well protected, but the average citizenry is certainly not. And that's one of the things that's sort of frustrating is, as a big fan of guns and someone who has a lot of guns locked away in a safe back in the old country, it's yeah, it's you definitely feel like, yeah, it's kind of a rules for thee, not for me, as regards personal protection.
Like I figure just I mean, it would be great for the law-abiding citizen to have guns, but if law and order has completely collapsed, would guns really be a good thing? Uh, as sort of would your sort of street level thug or thief be more dangerous with a gun if the government wasn't so harsh on it? Or would it be the
Well,
other way around and you wouldn't need so
yeah,
many private security forces if everyone
yeah,
was armed?
I do think it would be the other way around because as
That's the
as
Second
we
Amendment
see, yeah,
like arguments in the U.S. in a nutshell.
yeah, I mean, and I see it here all the time. So like the restrictions on gun ownership in South Africa have based virtually no effect on gangs being able to get their hands on guns. So there's there's a shit ton of gun crime that happens sort of in some of the areas around Cape Town, and virtually all the firearms are illegal.
Mm.
and you also have a situation where the police themselves are sort of filching inventory and then selling it to gangs. So even the police can't be trusted with their own firearms because
That's horrible.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
So there was actually a fairly big case recently where some police commissioner here in the Western Cape was busted for basically taking a bunch of inventoried firearms and then selling them to gangs. I mean, that sort of thing happens here.
that's rough. It's very
Yeah.
rough.
Yep.
Um, so who exactly are these government insiders who live in the ivory towers while normal houses are kind of up for kind of susceptible to violent crime? Like who are the major political parties in South Africa?
So I'll go from I'll tackle the minority parties first, and then go to the ANC because the ANC will take the most time because they're the ones in charge. So the DA is basically, if I was to categorize them, they basically be like the Democrat Party of 15 years ago. So they'd be like Obama style Democrats, right? So
Right.
they're not too radical. They're actually the provincial government where I live in the Western Cape. And compared to the rest of the country, yeah, things do work pretty good here. Potholes are filled, traffic lights work. The public service here in the Western Cape, as far as regards the municipality and the provincial government, it does work better. There's no denying that. But they are just kind of like, like I said, like slightly older Democrats. Basically, they're Democrats who haven't stepped on the gas enough yet. They did try to engage in kind of identity politics, like you saw in the U.S. So, like, all bad ideas come from the U.S. these days, and so they were going ahead of that. And the head of the party was a guy named Musi Maimani, and he was, big on this whole like, you don't understand the black condition, and he was basically like, he even basically like publicly shamed his wife for like having white privilege and stuff. And yeah, so it was pretty bad. But, yeah, it is absurd. But they they actually suffered some electoral setbacks, largely because of that, because the DA party essentially is the minority party. Okay, so the white voters, the colored voters, the Indian voters, and some of the more affluent blacks, they vote DA. So when the voter base began to feel like, okay, you guys are just ANC light, they started to lose. They didn't hemorrhage votes, but they did lose votes. So since then, they got rid of Musi, and they've sort of reformed and gone back to sort of what they were, which is sort of more of just a plain, typical liberal party, which is, competent, and they're headed by a guy now named John Steenhuisen. And so, yeah, that's the DA. Right. The EFF is the most radical of the political parties, and they're the third biggest party in the country after the ANC and DA.
Yeah.
So the EFF was actually founded by this guy, Julius Malema, who was head of the ANC Youth League, but he was basically expunged from the party for being too radical, partially. And so what the ANC's platform is like a bizarre amalgamation of like Leninism with Black nationalism. So
in the logo, you can see the sort of Pan-African, sort of Pan-African plus the sort of black fist plus the red for Lenin. I've seen, of course, clips of them singing "Kill the Boer" and them calling for the expropriation of farmer land and whatnot. Like how bad are they, and do they have any sort of chance of actually attaining power?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, sorry, I just lost my connection there for a second. But yeah, no, the EFF are definitely the more radical of the two. So they, like I said, they employ a kind of Black nationalism, very hostile rhetorically and politically to the white minority, and also rabidly socialist. So yeah, they're the ones that everybody's worried about if they ever take charge.
Right, but do they actually have the ability to take charge? Like, do they have, like, in terms of electoral popularity, like, do they actually have what it takes to turn South Africa into Zimbabwe? Or at least within the long run, or in the short, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of electoral power, I would say no. So the EFF is a minority party, and their vote share has increased, but not nearly as much as you might expect. So just to give an idea of kind of how shitty things are in South Africa, after the lockdowns, the unemployment rate in South Africa is now 45%.
Ouch.
So you have a lot of desperate people out there, but they are leery of sort of the EFF and some of their more radical positions and whatnot. So what is most likely to happen is the ANC will, at some point, they will dip below 50% of the vote. And then when that happens, they're most likely to form a coalition government with the EFF, at which point the EFF has, some pull in getting the ANC to do their policy.
All right, so that's the absolutely nightmare scenario, like hypothetically. But
yeah, and it could happen. And it could happen as soon as the next elections in 2024.
All right, so that's terrifying. Are there any other minor parties to rival these three, or are they just sort of regional interests?
Yeah, essentially they're just regional interests. So Inkatha Freedom Party, like I said, used to be a very significant political force. They were sort of the Zulu party, like I had mentioned, and they did have a lot of support. But what ended up happening is not this president, but the previous president of the ANC, what was his name again? I'm totally spacing. Jacob Zuma. Yeah. Jacob Zuma was he was a Zulu, And he was also some sort of like nobility figure there, not like the king or anything, because the Zulus do have a still currently existing monarchy. But what he was able to do is partially through patronage and again, this sort of ethnic politics, he was able to get the Zulus on side for the ANC. So
Right.
he was the guy who kind of destroyed the Inkatha Freedom Party as a major political force in the country and solidified the ANC rule in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. Apart from that, there are some minority parties. There's another one called Freedom Front Plus, and they're kind of the Afrikaner nationalist party.
I bet they're fun.
Yeah, they're actually really cool. I know some guys who a lot of my friends voted for the the Freedom Front Plus in the last election, and yeah, they're basically based in Red Pilled. And they exist. They got seats in parliament, but they're very small. And the people who vote for them are predominantly Afrikaners, although they do have support amongst coloreds as well. Again, because of the the cultural similarities and the presence in the Western Cape, and the coloreds do feel, at least a lot of them in the areas that are close to some of the black townships, they do feel sort of threatened by the ANC's agenda. And also they're somewhat resentful of the mass immigration into the Western Cape from places like the Eastern Cape and whatnot. So that is an element.
Gotcha. Right. So the big beast, the ANC, the Party of Mandela. How do you want to tackle it?
So do you want to know kind of like how it functions today, or how it did function, or what?
Okay, so we kind of alluded to exactly what its past was as this sort of revolutionary force that kneecapped its competition, and then what happens in 1994?
Yeah. So the ANC, like I said, initially they were somewhat pragmatic, but and that continued from Nelson Mandela to Thabo Mbeki. But then after the financial crisis, you had a lot of the communists who, that's another thing I forgot to mention. So the ANC formally is part of something called the Tripartite Alliance. So it's the ANC, and they are joined with COSATU, which is a major lefty labor union, and the third partner is the South African Communist Party, and they're in a official, formal relationship with the ANC. So what ended up happening is, after Mandela took power and put in this more pragmatic gear economic platform and stuff, the commies were sort of sidelined for about a decade. And so things were humming along. They didn't need to listen to the communists and whatnot, and they were kind of salty about it. But then after the economic crisis of 2008, that also hit South Africa particularly hard because of the decline in commodity purchases and whatnot, because that's still a driving factor of the South African economy. And so what ended up happening is, around this time, shortly afterwards, you had Jacob Zuma, who I mentioned is the Zulu guy who got the Zulus to vote for the ANC. He took control, and he also began listening to these communist influences, and he was also extremely corrupt. So it's sort of like a worst of both worlds things. So what you ended up having happen in the ANC is you have an emergent sort of three tiers to the party, which persists to this day. So the smallest faction of the ANC is the small, like, they want to do good, but they're sort of like powerless to do so. And that is definitely a minority in the ANC. I'm not making excuses for the ANC, but that sort of pragmatic faction is there. Like I know a guy who's sort of does briefings for some of these politicians, and they're like, yeah, like get it, but like we literally can't do anything to solve this because everyone else is fucked essentially. So
is this sort of a corruption issue, or is this like actively bad intentions?
So there's that's the other two angles. So the first group part of the ANC is the small pragmatic sort of Mandela-ish element of the party. But the two biggest factions in the ANC are the crooks, the looters, and patronage leeches. And the third element are the radical leftists and communists. So the ideological thrust of the ANC is and has been communism. So part of the platform of the ANC is something called the National Democratic Revolution. And what the National Democratic Revolution is essentially communism. That's literally what it is. So they want to basically impose that, and you have ideologues within the government who are very heavily pushing that.
Right.
However, their efforts are hamstrung by the looter faction. So in a way, it's because of these. I have to thank these looters to a certain extent because they make the bureaucracy so inefficient and corrupt that it's actually very difficult to sort of employ some of these, radical agendas that exist within the ANC. So because of the looter faction who is scared of getting their rice bowls broken, it sort of makes it more difficult to turn South Africa into Venezuela overnight, is essentially it. So you have all kinds of issues with the ANC. Corruption is a huge factor. Billions of rands disappear every year. And probably the best example of sort of the issues facing South Africa as regards corruption is just the exploding size of the bureaucracy over time. So a good example of this is Eskom. Eskom is the national power company of South Africa. And it used to have the cheapest electricity in the world. It ran, at a profit. Everything was fine. And it was this way for years. But since 2000, after apartheid, things were still working fine because you had a lot of the old guard still there. And like I said, they didn't fire them right away. But there's an interesting graph which you can look at, which shows electricity output relative to employees of Eskom between 2003 and 2006. And in that time period, you had virtually zero new megawatts of electricity become available. However, you saw like basically a tripling of the amount of people on payroll. And because of this, Eskom is perpetually on the brink of financial disaster. And so they have to get cash infusions from the government. They have to jack up, electricity rates. So now electricity is actually very expensive. And you see the same theme with all these state-owned enterprises. South African Airways, same story. Every year they need multi-billion rand cash injections to keep them afloat because, again, these organizations exist to provide jobs for friends and family first, and then the service that they're ostensibly supposed to provide second. So, and this is happening at all levels of the South African government to the point where that it's just absolutely financially unsustainable.
Are there any other industries like this? Like has, I don't know, any sort of natural resource extraction, like diamond production or gold extraction. Have those actually seen like any sort of hit from bureaucratic bloat, or is this just government industries?
So it's a little bit of both. So what I was talking about are these state-owned enterprises
Yes.
and the size of the bureaucracy itself. What you saw in South Africa, which affects the private sector tremendously, is something called Black economic empowerment. And
Okay.
what this is Black affirmative action for all businesses, all industries above a certain size. So what ends up happening? So, for example, Anglo American, which is a major gold mining outfit here in South Africa, they had to, as part of BEE regulations, they had to sell, not sell, they had to give away shares to a certain percentage of Black shareholders for no other reason than they were Black. And you also see there's also staffing requirements. So you have literal racial quotas in order to sort of qualify for certain BEE scores. And this becomes important because a lot of these private businesses, they end up, especially the larger ones, they end up having to do contract work for the government, right? So
Right.
what ends up happening is only businesses with BEE certification are even considered for these, these tenders. So what you have is a situation where it basically incentivizes fraud and cronyism at all levels of private enterprise above a certain size. So, for example, like my wife's uncle, he works in like housing development, and one of the problems he's retiring because he can't deal with his bullshit anymore. And one of the problems he had to deal with recently is basically suppliers. Suppliers now have to be BEE compliant. So brick suppliers in the Western Cape are automatically ignored because they're colored or white. And now they have to go to some guy in, the like the Free State or somewhere, and they're late. They don't pay their workers. They buy themselves a car and a nice house, and it's just absolute shit show. So it really is. It's bad news with the private industry as well, but it's executed. The way it's done is through this BEE racket.
We have something kind of similar in the U.S. where you have to, certain certain government, certain private agencies have to have a certain certain number of interactions with minority-owned businesses and female-owned businesses. If not, becoming one of those yourself. In order to get certain government benefits, you also have to have certain HR requirements. But I can only imagine the sort of punitive requirements that South Africa has.
No, it's like that on steroids. It's really bad, and these requirements are done regardless of ability, availability, or resources. And it's really bad too, particularly here in the Western Cape, because like I said, most of the largest racial group here are not Black, they're colored. So you have a situation where the biggest racial group in the province is excluded in many cases for employment opportunities just because, they're not Black. And it's a really big problem.
Isn't that sort of going full circle? Or instead of having the Boer exclusive privileges under apartheid, you just have sort of ANC cronyism the other way around, minus I guess trade restrictions from other countries, but
in terms of the local labor situation, that's essentially what happened. You had a changing of hats, essentially.
Yeah, it's quite brutal. So just moving on to the third topic, the actual battleground of politics in South Africa. So you have the factions of the DA, the ANC, and the EFF, right? You also have the various different ethnic groups, the sort of Anglos, Boers, the Zulus, the Khoisan, and the how do you pronounce the one that starts with an X?
Oh, the Xhosa.
Yes, yes. So how did these factions duke it out in the government, or
Well, in the government, it's basically, it's just black dominated.
or is it more of the ANC reigns hegemonically, and these other sort of insurrections from the DA or the EFF try and get their little favors.
Yeah,
Um,
that's essentially what it is. So the ANC does rule hegemonic, and like I said, they were sort of a Xhosa party for a long time, but now they're just kind of a black nationalist party. So they have the Xhosas, they got the Zulus, they got the Sutus, and Swanas, and all these other groups. They vote for them, and yeah, so all power comes from the ANC at this point as regards the uh, unitary state. Um, the only province that isn't controlled by the ANC is the Western Cape. So of course, the Western Cape, the provincial government does have some authority, as vis-a-vis the Constitution to do things, but they got to deal with what they're dealt with to a large degree in terms of like national policy and labor laws and shit like that.
yeah, it's strange how South Africa has, I think it's like three different capitals, like one in Joburg, one in Pretoria, and is there a third one? Like one in
Yeah,
Cape Town?
one in Cape Town. So the legislature, the parliament is in Cape Town. The judges, the judiciary is in Pretoria, and that might be in Joburg, and the the president is in the other city. So yeah, you have the three different branches of government in the three major cities of South Africa: Pretoria, Joburg, and Cape Town.
I think we kind of already went over the dynamics of how, I guess, these parties influence what the ANC actually decides to happen. Or is the country kind of at the will of the ANC, or are there sort of external actors acting upon the ANC in any way? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or
So,
like is there I guess Chinese influence, or is there like Chinese influence externally, or is there also I guess local politics influencing DNC or ANC decisions? Like what?
yeah. Yes to both.
Oh,
So there is major Chinese influence in the ANC. They're trying to do they're doing this typical sort of credit trap that they do with other countries, but it's not as extreme here in South Africa. Although the ANC is quite cozy with the CCP. Um, as regards local politics, basically the DA makes suggestions, and in the national parliament or the Freedom Front make suggestions, and they're basically ignored by the ANC and called racists and whatnot. So the ability of the DA, for example, to push the ANC more towards the center is very, very limited or non-existent. However, the EFF does manage to push the ANC further left. So they take their the ANC takes their voter base largely for granted, but the EFF is able to gobble up sort of the far left of the ANC to a certain degree. And what this results in doing is it sort of shifts the Overton window. And now the ANC is, parroting expropriation of land without compensation, nationalization of all healthcare in the country, things like that. So it's, they're really, they do manage to have the EFF does have some influence on the ANC, but by basically applying pressure from the left. As regards local governing battleground situations, those literally exist, and they're quite violent, because what ends up happening is they become these like local councillor positions become highly coveted as basically seats from which you can distribute patronage to yourself and your friends. So in local politics across South Africa, you will regularly have ANC councillors and would-be councillors murdering each other over who gets to be in charge of the local ANC council seat. So, and that's mostly due to having access to patronage and tax funds.
So is this sort of the corrupt versus the leftist trying to infight to see who can rule, or
so
is it more just corrupt versus corrupt and leftist
on the
versus
local
leftist?
On the local level, it's corrupt versus corrupt, essentially. At the national level, it's leftists versus the corrupt. But the leftists are also very often corrupt. So like Julius Malema, he's a radical leftist guy, but he's also managed to make himself quite wealthy during his time in parliament, and the EFF's involvement with like a local bank that was involved in, they were like a shareholder in a bank, which ended up being a huge scam and cost a ton of money and stuff. So the two often go hand in hand in South Africa, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, that's like that's absolutely brutal. So I guess that's sort of a continuation of the sort of inter-party violence that occurred even during apartheid. But since apartheid has, I guess, like have the little things kind of fallen apart, like infrastructure, or like you talked about the energy industry. Like has politics gone in the way of, I guess, actual development of the country, or is it a little bit more, I guess, stable than I'm giving it credit for?
No, you're absolutely right. Since 1994, things have deteriorated significantly. Just an example of this, in Johannesburg, there's a major bridge, which is starting to crumble. And the reason why is because that bridge has not been maintained since 1994. Nobody's done any work on that bridge. And you see this at basically all levels of of South Africa, in places where the state has any kind of control. So schools are very often a mess. They'll have like holes in the roofs, and they just don't get fixed. Bridges are crumbling. The electrical infrastructure. We have fairly regular rolling blackouts here in South Africa. And the reason for that is they fail to do routine scheduled maintenance on the power plants and the infrastructure. So it just quits working. And then they have to shed millions of megawatts across the country in order to prevent the whole grid from collapsing. So that's a regular occurrence down here that tends to happen about once every couple of months. And when it's really bad, it'll last for a number of weeks. And yeah, it's a real problem. So at all levels, the the corruption, the degradation is just apparent. I mean, you can't miss it, and everything which is the purview of the state, whether it's railway lines, whether it's the electrical infrastructure, schools, police stations. I mean, police. I was in a police station a while ago. I had to get an affidavit for something, and it was a shithole, and there was no reason it needed to be a shithole, but it was.
How would the how would the government be able to, I guess, get out of this sticky situation? Like, is it more or less? Well, the problem is the corruption plus the leftism, or is it, I guess, the complete social breakdown?
It's
just a little bit of everything.
It's all the above.
But in order to actually fix this, wouldn't the state have to get even more, I guess, centralized and all encompassing to reestablish order?
I wouldn't say so. I would say in order to fix it, a lot of problems could be solved just by the ANC, would just stop messing things up. So for example, there's a lot of, like you said, social breakdown, and a lot of that has to come with the crime. So people are more insular because, they're worried about their safety, about their property. But also, since 1994, you've basically seen happen to the black population and a good chunk of the coloreds, what you saw happen to blacks after the Great Society Project. So what ended up happening was, with the advent of mass social grants, sexual relations between men and women in this country largely became transactional. So the amount.
Are you talking about South Africa or the Great Society in the U.S.?
No, I'm talking about South Africa. I'm just using the Great Society as a.
Yeah, wasn't South Africa particularly hit hard by the AIDS crisis?
Yeah, tremendously hard. The amount of people with AIDS in South Africa is staggering. I'm just going to Google it real quick. AIDS rates in South Africa. But it's some, yeah. Okay, so 20% of the country has AIDS in South Africa. It's HIV positive.
And you have some form of universal health care, do you not?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's bad.
That's bad.
Yeah. Ouch. So, and just as an example, so South Africa's healthcare system is sort of two-tiered. So it has government hospitals and government clinics, but it also allows for private hospitals, at least for now. So, and one of the issues that they're having is they'll be like, oh, we don't have enough, medical facilities and whatnot, and the private sector, that's why we need national insurance and whatnot. But the thing they fail to realize, or thing they fail to mention, is that they've basically built hardly any hospitals since 1994, even though the population has increased tremendously. So, yeah, it's just totally effed up. So as regards fixing the current situation, I mean, the social damage that's been done. So like I said, the amount of single motherhood in South Africa is now the majority. Most kids, they don't have a dad around, and they are very often raised by their grandparents. And yeah, it's just a terrible, terrible situation. In order to fix this, God, I don't know what you'd have to do, because sort of putting the genie back in the bottle as regards, like family structure and whatnot is really, really, really difficult. I can't really think of very many situations where that's actually happened, to be frank. So as regards potential scenarios for South Africa going into the future.
Yeah.
There's
for this sort of last segment, I want to kind of wrap things up with I guess your overall predictions for the trajectory South Africa's on, um, or give us a good scenario after laying on the truth.
Yeah. So
So
I'll hit you with different things that could happen, because
okay,
the South African Institute of Race Relations, which is a pretty decent organization. They're sort of like a classical libertarian-ish sort of organization, and they do good polling in South Africa. And one of the interesting things that they did in the polling is that a lot of the sort of rhetoric coming from the state is sort of top down. So what the people want isn't necessarily what the ANC wants. So, go figure. People are ruled in a democracy. They're not represented by it, right? Like, we know this. And one of the examples that shows the ANC and the people do not see eye to eye is South Africans across all groups are sick and tired of mass illegal immigration into the country. So there was like millions of Zimbabweans who fled to the country after things went to hell there. And it causes problems. There's also
is this just Zimbabwe, or is this from?
It's from all over, but
like
the Zimbabweans are the biggest. Yeah,
like when we first started, you kind of were hesitant to say that South Africa was a third world country. I think it's because I guess there was something like structure and massive industry back in South Africa once upon a time, and as just a shining beacon to
the thing about South Africa that's weird is part of it is a third world country and part of it isn't. So that's the weird thing about it. Like, where I live and the cities, or the I guess you could call them sort of small cities around me. Yeah, they're straight up first world, man. They're nice. They're fairly affluent, not like rich, but people are making it and whatnot. But then you've got big chunks of the country which are, absolute shitholes, so you got both. There's parts of this country which are deep, like Africa style, third world countries. But then you've also got places in South Africa which are, where people live just as well as in, like Europe, for example. So you got a weird mix of both, and very often the two live side by side, right? So that's the odd thing about South Africa. Like, from where I go, I'm in a predominantly white Afrikaans speaking area. But, if I drive 10 minutes that way, I'm in a black township with thousands of people from the Eastern Cape, mostly living in shacks. And if I drive another way, I'm in sort of a working class colored sort of neighborhood. And it's just the amount of, quote unquote, of diversity, if you want to think about it that way.
Rainbow Nation.
Yeah, like literal just worlds apart, but so close together. It's very, very strange. I've never seen anything like it until I moved here. But yeah, so as far as potential scenarios for South Africa, the South African Institute of Race Relations, they did a study and they put forward a number of scenarios, all of which I think are plausible. So the first scenario, well, all of them except for one, I think are implausible. The one that I think is implausible is the Rainbow Nation. The Rainbow Nation makes a comeback. So, the vision of Mandela is realized.
The ANC just doubles down on what it's already been doing, but somehow it works.
So yeah, what I call the Rainbow Nation scenario is, they kick out the looters, the ANC is able to reform, and things go back to how they were in 1994, and everything's fine.
Right.
That could happen, but it's like in Dumb and Dumber. So you're saying there's a chance. It's not going to happen. But that's one potential scenario.
Right.
The other potential scenario is you have basically like a leftist tyranny. So like Venezuelan style. So what you would have is the ANC dips below 50%, and then they form a coalition government with the EFF, who, in return for their support, pushes the ANC hard left, and this place becomes very bad in pretty quick order. That is a quite plausible scenario which can happen in South Africa. Were you going to say something?
No. I'm just like, would it look something like Zimbabwe, or is there a more moderate example of this happening in other countries around South Africa?
I think it could potentially become like Zimbabwe in that scenario, but there's a number of things which set South Africa apart.
Is it the sort of state-owned industry that differentiates it?
No, what differentiates it is the fact that relative to Zimbabwe, South Africa's economy is still huge, and it has this legacy infrastructure, which, while not particularly well maintained, at least we have it. A lot of these other places didn't, and there is, parts of the economy which do function, and so it would be a lot harder to turn this place into Zimbabwe than Zimbabwe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a little bit more sense now.
Yeah, so just because we're starting off from a much higher level than Zimbabwe was, if that makes sense. So they could do it, but I think they just have a harder time of doing it. And also, there are even like the civil service and whatnot. They kind of know what side their bread's buttered on, and I think if you turn this place in Zimbabwe and smash all their rice bowls, or at least enough of their rice bowls, they'll be pretty pissed off. So, they're used to a level of luxury and affluence, which would be difficult to do if you turn this place into Zimbabwe, is what I'm getting. So, but that could happen. But you could also just have sort of slow, degrading leftist tyranny, which we already have, but it could become worse. So that's one scenario. The third scenario is you could have, and this is a long shot, but stranger things have happened, a rise of the right situation. So you have a kind of Lee Kuan Yew, Pinochet style character take charge in South Africa, and by force they push the country right, whether the government wants to or not.
I'm having a very hard time imagining this. Like, what does right even look like in Africa?
Well, to sort of go there, I'll sort of go based off opinion polling. So the things that South Africans are concerned about are pretty universal across the board. First off, the schools are shitty. They want better education. They want a growing economy. They don't particularly care about, the legacy of apartheid. They want shit to work. They want immigration control, and they really want law and order. So, and they're also, most South Africans are very socially conservative. So in terms of, and not in terms of promiscuity, but in terms of sexual mores as regards homosexuality and stuff like that. Trans kids, that wouldn't fly in South Africa, basically. So
would we be like a Huey Long kind of figure somehow arising out of the muck?
Yeah, maybe. The way I like to think about it is like a black Trump. I honestly think a black Trump, sort of a populist rightist sort of candidate, would do extremely well.
I think you're giving Trump a little bit too much credit.
Yeah,
but
all I mean by that, I don't mean in terms of substance. I mean in terms of style. That's what I mean. So sort of in terms of the style, the aesthetic of sort of a more bombastic, build a wall on Zimbabwe's border, and I'm going to crack skulls and bring law and order. I'm going to bring your jobs back. You're going to have tremendous jobs. That sort of thing I think would go potentially well. And the thing I point to this is there was some research done in South Africa, where they asked people that, if you could get what you wanted, like in terms of, better economic growth and whatnot, but you lost democracy, would you go for it? And a very large majority of South Africans said, yes, I'd take that deal. So I think the people would be on board for that. But I think the political climate is so against anything like that happening, it would be extremely difficult to pull off. So that's a potential scenario. It could happen. I'm not holding my breath, but it's a potential scenario. The last scenario. Okay.
Like which party do you think this would come from? Would this be some sort of insurgent on the ANC, or would the DA, have some sort of serious personality adjustment, or would it be like some new party who just kind of emerges? Like
if it were to happen, my money would be on some insurgent faction in the ANC, because they'll want to hold on to power and they'll see that the public tide has turned against them, but the party can't, as it currently exists, can't, course correct. So they'll just seize it by force and, basically turn the country into a dictatorship of sorts. But under pressure, they'll push the country economically and socially more to the right. If that scenario were to happen, that's how I would expect it to occur.
Right. All right.
But again, kind of a long shot, I think.
Yeah, very long shot. So you said your last scenario, right?
Yeah. The last scenario is basically more of the same. So what you'll see is the government continue to bumble its way to not, be able to furnish or to deliver on its promises or furnish basic services. And what you'll see more and more intensify is what I was just talking about earlier, the sort of de facto Balkanization of South Africa on a microcosm. So you'll have parts of South Africa which manage to maintain, despite the odds, relatively high standards of living and security. And if they want good schools, they'll build them themselves. If they want potholes fixed, they'll fix them themselves. If they want security, they'll buy security guards. And it'll basically be like living an expat lifestyle in your own country, essentially. So you'll have these stockades of affluence, and you'll have large, somewhat sprawling, more vulnerable areas which are prone to gang violence and whatnot. And that'll be sort of like the working class in South Africa. And then you'll have vast sprawls of rural and urban slums and poor who are in a very desperate situation without really any hope of getting out of it. So that's basically just sort of an intensification of what we already have. And that's what I kind of expect to happen to South Africa going forward.
I wouldn't say that's bleak, but it's not the bleakest country out there.
Yeah. It's bad for poor people because it means they're not going to have a chance to elevate themselves. And I don't think they will, just because of the current nature of the ANC and the social degradation which has occurred. But despite that, I do think these little stockades of affluence will persist, and they will seize more and more take over more and more de facto state roles than they do now. And hopefully, the sort of working class and whatnot will begin to realize this and sort of start looking after themselves a bit more as well, and not have to rely on the state so much. And they already are in a lot of these areas. So, yeah.
All right. So I think that's this good way of wrapping this episode up. Just kind of as an FYI, every single one of my my live streams has been monetized, other than this one. Like, like
is it the subject matter?
I have no clue why this one is has been demonetized. I have all of the out of all of the like, I'm pretty sure in the last like return to YouTube live stream, like I had talked about like siege and accelerationism, but like somehow South Africa gets demonetized. This is weird. But South Africa, it's such a spicy topic. It'll get you shut down. Brilliant.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, thanks for coming on such short notice, and sorry for keeping you up so late.
That's all right, man. I enjoyed the opportunity. I had fun talking to you.
Yeah,
big fan of your channel. So for those who are listening who haven't subbed, definitely sub to Clossington.
No. Wait, whoa. No. You're supposed to show your channel. As a guest.
Yeah,
right?
And of course, subscribe to Mr. Patriarch. It's the most based. It's the most red pilled. It's tremendous content. The best. Everyone agrees. Believe me. Subscribe.
Yeah. Are there any other good South African channels out there? Right. Like
there are some good ones. So there's Conscious Caracal, which you guys may know about. He's an Afrikaner guy who runs a decent channel. There's also Willem Petzer, but he's much less active on YouTube now than he used to be. There's also Reactionary Opinions, which was started by my friend. But he ended up getting me to jump on as a co-host with him. So that's Reactionary Opinions. They sort of do like news and topics and whatnot. There's also the Man Patria podcast, which is run by this based libertarian Xhosa guy named Dumo Denga. He's great. I like his show pretty good. Those are just some ones that you guys can check out on your own time. And for news and whatnot, there's a show called Morning Shot, run by a guy in Joburg called Roman Kabanak, and that's really good for sort of like a daily short news roundup.
Well, thank you for coming on, and we'll see you guys next time.
Peace.